In Manhattan's most private dining rooms, power doesn't announce itself. It settles quietly into the air, changes the way people breathe, the way they sit, the way they avoid eye contact without even realizing it. That night, inside a dimly lit restaurant tucked away on 57th Street, the atmosphere shifted the moment Victor Hale entered. It wasn't loud. There was no grand entrance, no spectacle. Conversation simply slowed, then softened, then stopped altogether, as if the room itself understood something the people inside it didn't want to admit. A senator halfway through a story suddenly found nothing worth finishing. A venture capitalist who had been laughing moments earlier lowered his voice and leaned back in his chair. Even the staff, trained to move like shadows, seemed to pause just a fraction longer than they should have. But Victor Hale didn't need attention. He carried something far more effective: presence. The kind built over decades of quiet decisions that ruined competitors, reshaped industries, and left entire boardrooms scrambling to recover from a single sentence. He was followed by his son, Ethan Hale, who moved with a completely different kind of energy. Where Victor was still and unreadable, Ethan was sharp, alert, constantly calculating. His reputation in New York had grown faster than his company: decisive, aggressive, and known for cutting people off the moment they stopped being useful. If Victor had built the empire, Ethan had learned how to weaponize it. And then there was the detail that unsettled people the most. Victor Hale was in a wheelchair. It didn't make him look weak. If anything, it made the contrast more uncomfortable. His body had clearly begun to fail him. Age had carved deep lines into his face, slowed his movements, thinned his frame. But his eyes hadn't changed at all. They were steady, observant, and distant in a way that made it impossible to tell what he was thinking, or if he was thinking about you at all. That uncertainty was what people feared. Across the dining room, near the service station, Lena Ricci adjusted her apron for the third time in less than a minute, trying to keep her hands from shaking. She wasn't supposed to be working that section tonight. Someone had called in sick, and she had taken the shift without thinking too much about it. At the time, it felt like a small opportunity. Extra tips. One more step towards staying afloat. Now, standing there with a clear view of Table 1, it felt like a mistake she wouldn't be able to undo. Her shoes, bought cheaply to match the restaurant's strict dress code, pressed painfully against her heels every time she shifted her weight. She had been on her feet since early afternoon, and the dull ache running up her legs had settled into something constant, something she no longer even tried to ignore. But discomfort wasn't what worried her. 3 days from now, her rent was due, and in a hospital nearly 500 miles away, her mother's condition had taken another turn, one that came with new tests, new treatments, and bills that arrived faster than Lena could open them. This job wasn't optional. It wasn't temporary. It was the only thing standing between her and a situation she wasn't ready to face. Table 1 in 2 minutes. The voice came through the staff channel, low and precise. Laurent Dubois, the maitre d', moved along the line of servers with controlled urgency, his posture perfect, his expression tight with focus. He didn't raise his voice, but he didn't need to. Everyone listened when he spoke, not out of respect, but because they understood the consequences of getting something wrong. "You will not engage," he said, stopping just long enough for his words to settle. "You will not improvise. You will not assume." His eyes briefly met Lena's. "You respond only when addressed. Otherwise, you remain invisible." There was a quiet murmur of acknowledgement from the staff, but Lena felt the weight of his gaze linger a second longer than necessary, as if he already expected her to be the one who slipped. Everyone knew who was arriving. The Hales didn't just dine, they occupied space. Entire sections were cleared for them, not by request, but by habit. Staff schedules shifted around their visits. Chefs adjusted menus. Managers monitored every detail twice. Because mistakes around them didn't get corrected, they got remembered. When the doors opened, the shift in the room became impossible to ignore. Security entered first, scanning quickly but thoroughly, their presence subtle enough not to disturb the illusion of normalcy, but obvious enough to remind everyone that this wasn't an ordinary dinner. Ethan followed, removing his earpiece as he crossed into the dining room, already mid-conversation, already thinking 3 steps ahead of whatever was being discussed. Victor came last. He was wheeled in slowly, deliberately, as though time itself adjusted to his pace. And just like that, the room belonged to him. Lena moved before she could hesitate. The crystal pitcher felt heavier in her hands than it had minutes earlier, and she became acutely aware of every step she took toward the table. The distance, the angle, the silence between movements. She focused on the mechanics. That was how you survived here. Position. Pour. Step back. No eye contact, no hesitation, no existence beyond the task. At the table, Ethan was speaking, his tone controlled but strained in a way that suggested this conversation had already happened more than once. "The board is expecting a decision," he said. "You can't keep pushing this." Victor didn't respond immediately. His attention rested on the empty plate in front of him, as if the conversation happening around him was secondary to something only he could see. "I'm not pushing anything," he said at last, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "I'm considering." Ethan exhaled, frustration slipping through despite his effort to contain it. "You've been considering for 6 months. Lena stepped forward at exactly the right moment, positioning herself beside Victor with practiced precision. She tilted the pitcher. The water flowed cleanly into the glass. For a second, everything went exactly as it should. Then Victor spoke. "The water is too cold." It wasn't the complaint that caused the tension. It was the way he said it. Not irritated, not loud, certain. Lena stopped mid-motion, her grip tightening slightly around the pitcher as the sound of ice shifting in the glass suddenly felt far louder than it should have. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his temple. "It's water." "It hurts," Victor replied, his tone flattening. "No one pays attention anymore." Laurent was already approaching, his composure intact, but his pace just slightly faster than usual. "My apologies, Mr. Hale. We'll replace it immediately." He stepped between Lena and the table, guiding her away with a subtle but unmistakable firmness. Lena retreated to the service station, her heart still beating faster than it should have been. She had done nothing wrong. Technically. And yet, something about the exchange lingered in her mind. From a distance, she watched them again. Ethan focused on control, pushing forward, unwilling to slow down. Victor, detached, uninterested, as though none of it mattered anymore. It wasn't anger she noticed, it was absence. And for reasons she couldn't explain, that unsettled her more than anything else. Because in a room full of people who would have given anything to sit at that table, the most powerful man there looked like he didn't want to be anywhere at all. And Lena Ricci, who had spent her entire life trying to stay unnoticed, was about to be the only person who saw it. By the time the first course reached table 1, the rest of the restaurant had resumed its rhythm, but only on the surface. Beneath it, there was a quiet awareness that never quite disappeared. Conversations stayed softer around that corner. Servers adjusted their routes to avoid crossing too close unless necessary. Even the kitchen, usually loud with clattering pans and overlapping voices, carried a sharper edge of discipline. Everyone was working, but part of their attention remained fixed on one table. Lena stayed near the side station. polishing glasses that were already spotless, her movements automatic while her thoughts refused to settle. She had seen difficult guests before. Entitled ones, impatient ones, even unpredictable ones. But this felt different. It wasn't just about pressure or reputation. It was something harder to define, something she couldn't quite name. When Victor Hale spoke, it wasn't the volume that carried weight, it was the finality. Like every word came from a place where decisions had already been made long before they were spoken. In the kitchen, the energy had shifted in response. Chef Marco stood at the pass, his focus absolute, his temper held tightly beneath the surface. He wasn't the kind of chef who tolerated failure on a normal night. Tonight, the margin for error didn't exist at all. Table 1 is priority, he said without looking up. Every plate perfect, every detail exact. A line cook nodded quickly, adjusting the plating of a dish that would have already been considered flawless anywhere else. Marco leaned in, inspecting it for another second before giving a short, sharp nod. Send it. The first course arrived, a delicate composition designed more for precision than comfort. The kind of dish that required explanation, appreciation, and a certain mindset to enjoy. Lena wasn't the one serving it, but she watched from a distance anyway. Ethan acknowledged it with a brief glance, then returned to his phone for a moment before setting it aside. Victor didn't react at all. The plate sat in front of him, untouched. Minutes passed. Ethan began eating, methodically without much interest, more out of habit than enjoyment. Victor remained still. From across the room, Lena noticed something small. So small it would have been easy to miss. Victor's hand rested near the edge of the table, his fingers lightly brushing against the fabric of the tablecloth, as if he were feeling its texture rather than noticing the food placed inches away from him. It wasn't impatience. It wasn't irritation. It was distraction. The plate was eventually cleared, untouched. In the kitchen, the reaction was immediate. He didn't touch it? Marco's voice cut through the room, sharp with disbelief. A server shook his head. Not even once. Marco exhaled slowly, then turned back to the line. Next course. There was no outburst, no thrown utensils, just a tighter focus, a quieter intensity that spread through the staff like a signal. Back on the floor, Lena tried to push the thought aside. It wasn't her problem, it wasn't her table. But the image stayed with her, the untouched plate, the absent expression, the way Victor's attention seemed to drift somewhere far beyond the room. When the second course arrived, the pattern repeated. Ethan ate, Victor didn't. This time, however, the silence between them carried more weight. "You need to eat something," Ethan said finally, his voice controlled but firmer now. Victor didn't look at him. "It has no taste." Ethan set his fork down, the faint sound of metal against porcelain sharper than it should have been. "It's one of the best kitchens in the city." Victor's gaze shifted slightly, but not toward the food. "That doesn't mean anything." There was a pause. Not long, but long enough to feel deliberate. "You're doing this again," Ethan said, quieter now, frustration contained but unmistakable. "You're rejecting everything just to make a point." Victor turned his head then, slowly, his expression unchanged. "If I wanted to make a point," he said, "you would know." The conversation ended there, not resolved, just closed. Lena looked away, focusing again on her station, but the exchange had already settled into her thoughts. There was tension there, but it wasn't new. It felt practiced, repeated. By the time the main course was served, the pattern had become undeniable. 3 dishes, 3 untouched plates. The kitchen was no longer hiding its frustration. Marco stood rigid at the pass, arms crossed, watching as the third plate returned nearly identical to how it had left. "This doesn't make sense," one of the cooks muttered under his breath. Marco didn't respond immediately. He stepped forward, looking down at the dish, then back toward the dining room, his expression unreadable. "It's not the food," he said finally. Lena heard it, and something about that statement stayed with her. Back at table 1, Ethan had stopped trying to mask his irritation. "This is getting ridiculous," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You haven't eaten all day." Victor's attention had returned to the tablecloth, his fingers still tracing that same absent pattern. "The food isn't the problem," Ethan continued. "You are." Victor's hand stopped moving. For the first time that evening there was a shift, subtle but unmistakable. He looked at his son, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with something far heavier. "You think everything is a problem that needs to be fixed," Victor said quietly. Ethan leaned back slightly, caught off guard by the change in tone. "That's how things get done." Victor held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked away again. "That's how things get lost." The words lingered longer than the conversation itself. Ethan didn't respond. He picked up his glass instead, taking a slow sip as if resetting the moment. From across the room, Lena felt something shift inside her understanding of the situation. This wasn't about the food, it wasn't even about control, it was something else entirely. She moved toward the service station again, reaching for a fresh basket of bread as part of her rotation. The bread was simple compared to the rest of the menu, rustic, warm, and be served with cultured butter. It wasn't meant to be the highlight of the meal, just an accompaniment. As she approached the table, she slowed slightly, not enough to break protocol, but enough to observe more closely. Victor's posture had changed. He wasn't rigid anymore. He looked tired, not physically, something deeper. She placed the basket carefully at the center of the table, her movements precise, her expression neutral. As she turned to step away, Victor's hand moved, slowly, deliberately. He reached toward the bread. Lena paused, just for a fraction of a second. Victor's fingers pressed lightly against the crust, testing it, as though he were expecting something different from what he found. He didn't pick it up, he didn't break it, he simply felt it. "Too hard," he murmured. The words were quiet, almost lost beneath the ambient noise of the room. But Lena heard them, and for reasons she couldn't explain, those 2 words landed differently than everything that had come before. It wasn't a complaint, not really. It sounded like recognition, like something wasn't matching a memory. Lena stepped back, returning to her station, but her mind was no longer on her tasks. Something was starting to connect. Fragments of observation forming a pattern she hadn't been looking for. The untouched food, the lack of reaction, the focus on texture instead of taste. And now, the bread. Across the room, Victor's hand had withdrawn, resting again on the table, still and distant. But his expression had shifted, just slightly. Not frustration, not irritation, something closer to absence turning into awareness. Lena felt it then, a quiet realization forming at the edge of her thoughts. Not complete, not certain, but enough to make her hesitate. Because suddenly, the situation didn't feel random anymore, it felt specific. And whatever was missing from that table, it wasn't something money could buy. By the time the dining room settled into its late evening rhythm, something at table 1 had already begun to unravel. Quietly, almost invisibly, but with a kind of inevitability that no one in the room could have explained if asked. From a distance, everything still looked intact. The lighting remained soft, the service precise, the surrounding tables engaged in carefully curated conversations. Plates continued to move in and out of the kitchen with practiced efficiency, and glasses were refilled before anyone needed to ask. But at that table, the illusion had started to crack. 3 courses had come and gone without a single bite from Victor Hale, and even the staff who had been trained never to speculate were beginning to feel the weight of it. It wasn't just unusual. It was disruptive in a way that had nothing to do with etiquette and everything to do with something far more human. In the kitchen, Marco had stopped pretending it was about execution. He stood at the pass in silence now, watching every plate that left his line with the kind of focus usually reserved for competition, not service. When the last dish returned nearly untouched, he didn't raise his voice or throw anything. He simply exhaled, long and controlled, and said, "Send the bread again," as if simplifying the meal might somehow reach a place the rest of his menu could not. At the table, Ethan had run out of patience. "You're not even trying," he said, his voice low enough not to draw attention, but sharp enough to carry intent. "At least taste it." Victor didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed somewhere just beyond the table, as though the conversation existed at a distance he wasn't willing to close. "I already know what it tastes like," he said after a moment. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his jaw tightening. "Then what is this about?" Victor's fingers moved again, lightly brushing the linen beneath his hand, tracing the same absent pattern Lena had noticed earlier. "It's empty," he said. The answer was simple, but it didn't resolve anything. If anything, it deepened the disconnect between them. Ethan let out a breath that sounded more like restraint than frustration. "You're sitting in one of the best restaurants in the country." Victor turned his head just enough to look at him, and for a brief moment there was clarity in his expression. Sharp, direct, impossible to ignore. That's the problem. Lena heard it all from across the room. She wasn't supposed to be listening, but it wasn't something you could tune out once you noticed it. There was a tension in the way Victor spoke. Not anger, not even dissatisfaction, but something quieter and far more unsettling. It wasn't rejection. It was absence. She picked up the fresh bread basket from the station, feeling the warmth of it through the cloth as she made her way back toward the table. Her steps were measured, controlled, exactly as they had been all night, but her attention had shifted entirely. She wasn't just performing a task anymore. She was observing. When she reached the table, she placed the basket carefully within Victor's reach, keeping her posture neutral, her presence minimal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Victor's hand moved. His fingers pressed into the surface of the bread again, testing it, almost curiously this time, as if he were searching for something he couldn't quite define. He didn't pick it up. He didn't tear it. He simply held it there, his fingertips resting against the crust. "Too hard," he said quietly. Lena felt something shift inside her. It wasn't the complaint itself. It was the way he said it, the way his voice carried a kind of quiet recognition, as though he wasn't describing the bread in front of him but comparing it to something else entirely. Something remembered. She stepped back as she was supposed to, returning to the edge of the service area, but her focus didn't leave the table. Instead, her thoughts moved somewhere else. Years ago, in a small kitchen far from Manhattan, her grandfather had done the same thing. He would sit at the table long after dinner was served, touching the bread before eating it, pressing it lightly between his fingers as if testing its worth, as if deciding whether it deserved to be part of the meal. And when the food didn't feel right, he wouldn't complain about flavor or presentation. He would say it was empty. At the time, Lena hadn't understood what he meant. Now, watching Victor Hale sit in silence in a room full of perfection, she began to. Her gaze shifted to the untouched plates, then back to Victor, then to Ethan, who was watching his father with a mixture of frustration and something else he seemed unwilling to acknowledge. And suddenly, the pattern became clear. This wasn't about refinement. It wasn't about quality. It wasn't even about control. It was about memory. Lena felt her pulse quicken slightly as the realization settled into place. She wasn't guessing anymore. She was recognizing something she had seen before, something she had lived with. Her grandfather had gone through the same phase near the end. Food that looked perfect meant nothing to him. Meals prepared with care but without familiarity felt distant, hollow, disconnected from the life he remembered. He hadn't been rejecting food. He had been searching for something inside it. And Victor Hale, surrounded by more luxury than most people would experience in a lifetime, was doing the exact same thing. She shouldn't have done anything. Everything in her training, in her instincts, in her need to keep this job told her to walk away, to let the moment pass, to remain exactly what she was supposed to be. Unseen, unheard, replaceable. Laurent was already watching the floor again, his attention sharp, his expectations clear. One mistake here wouldn't just cost her the night, it would cost her everything. But as Lena looked at Victor again, really looked at him this time, she saw something that made the decision harder to ignore. It wasn't power, it wasn't authority, it wasn't even anger, it was loneliness, the kind that doesn't come from being alone, but from being surrounded by things that no longer mean anything. She didn't think about it any further. If she had, she would have stopped. Instead, she moved. The distance between her and the table wasn't far, but it felt longer this time, heavier, charged with something that made every step feel deliberate. Ethan noticed her approach first, his expression tightening slightly as she stepped closer than necessary. "We didn't call for anything," he said. Lena didn't respond. Not to him. Her attention remained on Victor. She leaned in, not enough to cause a scene, not enough to break the room, but enough to cross the invisible line that had been set for her the moment the night began. Enough to be heard. And then, quietly, in a tone that didn't belong in that room, but somehow felt more real than anything else that had been said all evening, she spoke a single word. "Scarpetta." It was soft, almost nothing. But Victor reacted as if the entire room had changed. His head lifted, not slowly, not uncertainly, immediately. For the first time that night his eyes focused completely. Not past her, not through her. On her. "What did you say?" The question wasn't irritated. It wasn't dismissive. It carried something else entirely. Recognition. Lena held his gaze, steady despite the tension building around her, despite the fact that she could feel Laurent already moving toward the table, despite the awareness that every second she remained there was a risk she couldn't afford. She leaned in slightly closer. "Scarpetta," she repeated, more clearly this time. The word hung between them, not as language, as memory. Victor's expression changed, not dramatically, but undeniably. The distance in his eyes shifted, replaced by something sharper, something present, and something that hadn't been there all night. And for the first time since he had entered the restaurant, Victor Hale looked awake. The word didn't echo across the room, but the effect of it did. For a few seconds after Lena spoke, nothing around them seemed to move in quite the same way. The restaurant hadn't fallen silent. Conversation still existed. Glasses still clinked. But there was a subtle shift in attention, the kind that happens when something unusual is felt rather than seen. At table 1, however, the change was undeniable. Victor Hale was no longer distant. He was present. His eyes remained fixed on Lena, studying her with an intensity that was no longer passive. It wasn't suspicion, and it wasn't irritation. It was something far more precise, as though he were searching her face for confirmation of something he hadn't allowed himself to believe. Ethan noticed it immediately, and the shift in his posture was subtle but sharp. He straightened slightly in his chair, his attention moving from the table to Lena with a focus that was far less forgiving than his father's. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked. His voice controlled, but edged with something colder now. Lena didn't answer him. Not because she was trying to defy him, but because in that moment responding to Ethan felt irrelevant. Whatever had just happened didn't belong to him. Victor spoke before she could say anything else. "Say it again." There was no hesitation in his tone this time, no distance, just clarity. Lena repeated the word, and this time she didn't whisper it. "Scarpetta." Victor leaned back slightly, as if the word itself had reached somewhere physical, somewhere real. For a brief moment, the rigid structure he had carried all evening softened. Not completely, not dramatically, but enough to reveal something beneath it. "My mother used to say that," he murmured, almost to himself. She would say, "If you leave the sauce behind, you insult the meal, because that's where everything lives." Lena felt a quiet certainty settle inside her. She hadn't been guessing. She had been right. "It's not about the food," she said carefully. "It's about what it reminds you of." Ethan's expression hardened. "That's enough," he said, his patience thinning in a way that no longer tried to hide itself. "You've crossed a line." But Victor didn't look at him. He was still looking at Lena. "Well, what would you do?" he asked. It was a strange question, and for a second, Lena wasn't sure how to answer it. She became aware again of where she was, of who she was speaking to, of the consequences that were already forming around her. But the moment had already passed the point where caution mattered. "I'd stop trying to impress you," she said, "and I'd give you something real." That was the moment everything shifted from unusual to unacceptable. Laurent reached the table just seconds later, his composure intact but his expression tight with controlled alarm. "Mr. Hale, I sincerely apologize," he said quickly. "She's new. This won't happen again." He reached for Lena's arm, this time less subtle than before. But Victor raised his hand slightly. "Leave her." Laurent stopped immediately. The authority in that single gesture didn't need explanation. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way people might expect. There was no raised voice, no scene, no public disruption. Victor simply asked for something that wasn't on the menu. "Bring me pasta," he said. "Simple, tomato sauce, nothing else." Laurent hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second, and in a place like this that hesitation said everything. "Of course," he replied, before turning quickly toward the kitchen. What arrived 10 minutes later didn't belong in that room. It wasn't plated for presentation, it wasn't structured for approval. It didn't require explanation, it was just pasta. And for the first time that night, Victor Hale ate. Not carefully, not formally, not with the restraint expected of a man in his position. He ate like someone who had been waiting. Lena didn't stay at the table. She returned to her station, her pulse still unsettled, her thoughts trying to catch up with what had just happened. Around her, the restaurant had resumed its rhythm again, but it no longer felt the same. Something had shifted, and everyone had felt it. The dinner ended without further incident. Victor left the same way he had arrived, quietly, deliberately, without acknowledgement of the room around him. But as he passed Lena, his gaze met hers one last time. There was no smile, no words, just a look that carried recognition, and something else she couldn't quite define. Ethan didn't look at her at all. The doors closed behind them, and the tension that had held the room together all evening released all at once. Sound returned. Movement returned, and the illusion of normalcy snapped back into place. Laurent didn't wait. He approached Lena with the same controlled precision he carried throughout the night, but the restraint was gone now. "What you did tonight," he said quietly, "was completely unacceptable." Lena held her ground, though she could feel the weight of what was coming. "He ate?" she said. Laurent's expression didn't change. "That is not your responsibility." He hadn't eaten all night. "And that," Laurent replied, "is not your decision to fix." There was no argument after that. There didn't need to be. "Turn in your apron." The words landed exactly as expected, but they still carried weight. Lena didn't protest. She didn't try to explain herself. She untied the apron slowly, folded it once out of habit, and placed it on the counter beside her. Around her, the staff avoided looking directly at her, not out of cruelty, but out of understanding. This was how it worked. You didn't get second chances here. She stepped out into the night less than 10 minutes later, the cold air hitting her harder than she expected, as though her body had finally caught up with everything that had happened. The city moved around her like nothing had changed. Cars passed, people walked, lights reflected off glass and steel, and just like that, she had nothing. The next 48 hours confirmed it. Calls weren't returned. Interviews that had been scheduled disappeared without explanation. One restaurant manager, more honest than the others, told her directly that her name had already been mentioned, not in a way that left room for interpretation. By the third day, the situation had moved past stress and into something sharper: urgency. The notice on her apartment door wasn't unexpected, but seeing it there made it real in a way she hadn't been prepared for. The paper was cheap, the ink slightly faded, but the message was clear enough without needing emphasis. She stood there longer than necessary, staring at it, as though looking at it differently might change what it meant. Inside, the apartment felt smaller than usual, quieter. Her phone rang twice within the hour. Both times, she let it go unanswered. She already knew what it was. It wasn't just the job she had lost. It was the space it had created, the fragile balance she had been maintaining without realizing how thin it actually was. The only thing left on her table that didn't belong to that collapse was a small piece of paper, and she had almost forgotten about it. Victor had slipped it to her just before leaving, so casually that it hadn't drawn attention at the time. She hadn't even looked at it properly until now. A name, a number, nothing else. It didn't feel like an opportunity. It felt like a risk. Because men like Victor Hale didn't operate on instinct alone. Everything they did had a reason, and whatever reason had led him to her. She wasn't sure she wanted to understand it. The phone rang again. This time, she picked it up. Not to answer it, just to stop the sound. For a long moment, she stood there, the paper in one hand, the phone in the other, caught between two choices that didn't feel like choices at all. Walk away and accept what was coming, or step into something she didn't understand, and with no guarantee of what waited on the other side. Outside, a siren passed in the distance, fading quickly into the noise of the city. Inside, the silence felt heavier. Lena looked down at the number again. Then, slowly, she dialed it. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. Calm, precise, controlled. Private office. Lena hesitated for the briefest moment. Then she spoke. My name is Lena Ricci. There was a pause on the other end, not long, but deliberate. We've been expecting your call. And in that moment, Lena realized something she hadn't fully understood until now. This hadn't started in the restaurant. She had just stepped into something that had already been set in motion. The voice on the phone didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't hesitate, and didn't sound surprised in the way Lena had expected. It carried the kind of calm that comes from knowing more than it says, and that alone was enough to make her uneasy. "You'll come to Oyster Bay," the woman said, as if the decision had already been made. "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. The address will be sent to your phone." There was a brief pause, just long enough for Lena to think about asking something. Anything that might give her a sense of control over what she was walking into. But before she could speak, the voice continued. "Be on time." The line disconnected without a goodbye. The next day, the city felt different to Lena, though nothing around her had actually changed. The same traffic, the same noise, the same endless movement of people going somewhere with purpose. But she moved through it with a sense of detachment, as if she had already stepped halfway out of the life she knew and into something she couldn't yet define. By the time the train carried her out toward Long Island, the buildings had begun to thin, the skyline fading into something quieter, more contained. It wasn't just distance. It felt like a transition between two worlds that didn't fully belong to each other. When the car finally turned through the iron gates of the Hale estate, Lena understood why. The place didn't feel like a home. It felt like a statement. Stone walls rose high enough to block the view from outside, and the driveway stretched longer than seemed necessary, lined with trees that had been there long before anyone currently living behind those gates had been born. Everything about it suggested permanence, control, and a history that didn't need to explain itself to anyone. Lena stepped out of the car with a quiet awareness of how out of place she was, not just in appearance but in context. Her clothes were clean, carefully chosen, but they didn't belong here. Nothing about her did. Before she could reach the door, it opened. The woman standing there carried herself with a presence that felt familiar, though Lena couldn't immediately place why. She was older, composed, and sharp in a way that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with authority. "Lena Ricci," she said, her tone measured, her gaze assessing. "You're exactly on time." "I didn't want to be late," Lena replied. "That would have been a mistake," the woman said simply, stepping aside to let her in. The interior of the estate was quieter than Lena expected. Not empty. Staff moved through the space with subtle efficiency, but controlled. Conversations were kept low, footsteps softened by thick rugs and polished floors. It felt less like a home where people lived and more like a place where decisions were made. The woman led her through a series of rooms that grew increasingly private, until they reached a library that seemed almost untouched by time. Shelves lined every wall, filled with books that looked more like records than reading material, and the air carried a faint scent of paper and leather that hadn't been disturbed recently. "Sit," the woman said. Lena did, though she remained aware of her posture, her hands, the way she held herself. It felt less like an invitation and more like an evaluation. "I'm Margaret Vance," the woman continued. "I handle what Mr. Hale prefers not to explain himself." Lena nodded slightly. "You were expecting me?" Margaret allowed the faintest hint of acknowledgement. "We were." There was something deliberate in the way she said it. Something that suggested Lena's arrival wasn't the result of a spontaneous decision made in a restaurant. It had been anticipated. "You're wondering why you're here," Margaret said, taking a seat across from her. "Yes?" "Good, that means you're still thinking clearly." The comment wasn't reassuring. Margaret studied her for a moment longer before continuing. "What you did at the restaurant was not accidental." Lena frowned slightly. "I just said a word." "No," Margaret said, her tone calm but precise. You recognized something. That's different. The distinction mattered more than Lena expected. She hadn't thought of it that way, but hearing it framed like that shifted her understanding of the moment. It wasn't luck. It wasn't instinct alone. It had been recognition. Victor Hale hasn't responded to anything in that way for years, Margaret continued. Not to people, not to conversations, not to the life he built. He participates when necessary, but he doesn't engage. Lena thought back to the restaurant, to the way Victor had looked at the table, the food, the room itself. Detached. But he responded to you, Margaret said, and that makes you relevant. There was no warmth in the statement, just fact. Before Lena could respond, the door behind them opened. The shift in the room was immediate. Ethan Hale entered without announcement, his presence sharper here than it had been in the restaurant. There, he had been controlled, contained by environment and expectation. Here, on his own ground, he carried something more direct, more dangerous. His gaze moved to Lena instantly, not with curiosity but with assessment. So, this is her. Margaret didn't stand. She has a name, she said. Ethan ignored the correction. I ran your background, he said to Lena, his tone almost conversational, though nothing about it felt casual. You've had 3 jobs in the past 2 years, none of them lasting more than 8 months. Your mother's medical expenses exceed anything you could realistically manage, and you're currently behind on rent. Lena felt the words land one by one, not because they were surprising, but because of how precisely they were delivered. He wasn't guessing, he knew. You walked into that restaurant desperate, Ethan continued, taking a step closer. And somehow, you managed to position yourself in front of my father at exactly the right moment. That wasn't planned, Lena said, keeping her voice steady. Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether to believe her. Everything is planned, he said. The only difference is whether you understand the plan you're part of. Margaret watched the exchange without interrupting. What do you think this is? Ethan continued. An opportunity? A coincidence? My father has spent decades building something that people spend their entire lives trying to get close to. And now you're here because you said one word. It wasn't just a word, Lena replied. For the first time, Ethan's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough to suggest that she had said something he hadn't expected. No, he agreed. It wasn't. The room fell into a brief silence that felt less like a pause and more like calculation. You reminded him of something, Ethan said finally, more quietly now. And that's a problem. Why? Because memory, Ethan replied, makes people unpredictable. Margaret spoke then, her tone cutting cleanly through the tension. Victor wants her here. Ethan turned slightly, his focus shifting but not softening. That doesn't mean it's a good idea. No, Margaret said. It means it's already decided. The power dynamic in the room shifted again, subtly but clearly. Ethan didn't argue further, but the tension in his posture remained, coiled rather than released. Elena became aware of something else then, not just the conflict in front of her, but the shape of it. This wasn't about her. Not entirely. There was something deeper here, something that had existed long before she walked into that restaurant, and she had stepped directly into the middle of it without realizing how far it extended. Tell me something, Ethan said, turning back to her. Your last name, Ricci, where does it come from? The question seemed simple, but the way he asked it made it feel anything but. It's my grandfather's, Lena said. He came from Italy. I don't know much beyond that. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Interesting, he said. Margaret noticed it too, the shift, the detail. Not enough to explain anything, but enough to matter. From somewhere deeper in the house, a sound carried faintly through the hallway, a movement, slow but deliberate. Margaret stood. "He's awake," she said. Lena felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear exactly, but anticipation mixed with uncertainty. Because whatever this was, this situation, this invitation, this tension, it hadn't started with her, and it wasn't going to end with her either. As they moved toward the inner part of the estate, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't being brought in to help something. She was being brought in to reveal something. And whatever that truth was, it had already begun to surface. By the time Lena was led into Victor Hale's private study, the house had grown even quieter, as if the rest of the estate understood that something important was about to unfold and had chosen, instinctively, to stay out of its way. The room itself was nothing like the rest of the house. Where the exterior had been imposing and deliberate, this space felt older, more personal, as though it had been built for a version of Victor Hale that no longer existed publicly. The shelves weren't arranged for display, but for use, filled with worn ledgers, notebooks, and folders that looked like they had been opened and closed countless times over the years. The desk, heavy and unpolished compared to the rest of the estate, carried marks of use rather than perfection. Victor sat near the window, not in the wheelchair Lena had seen at the restaurant, but in a high-backed chair, a cane resting against the side of it. He looked smaller here, not because he had changed, but because the room revealed something different about him, something less constructed, less controlled. He didn't speak immediately when they entered. Instead, he watched Lena with the same steady focus she had seen the night before, but without the distance. There was intent in it now, a kind of quiet urgency that hadn't been there before. "You came," he said finally. Lena nodded. "You asked me to." Victor gave a faint, almost absent acknowledgement of that. "Yes," he said. "I did." Margaret remained near the door, her presence unobtrusive but intentional, while Ethan stayed farther back, leaning slightly against the wall as though he had chosen a position that allowed him to observe without being directly involved. The distance didn't make him less present. If anything, it made him more dangerous. Victor gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." Lena did, aware of the weight of the moment, but not entirely sure what she was stepping into. For a few seconds, there was no conversation at all. Victor simply studied her, his expression unreadable but focused, as if he were comparing what he saw in front of him with something stored somewhere deeper. Then he asked a question that seemed, at first, almost out of place. "What was your grandfather's name?" Lena hadn't expected that. "Antonio Ricci," she said. But everyone called him Tony. Victor's gaze didn't shift. "And his father?" She hesitated slightly, trying to recall something she hadn't thought about in years. "I think Pietro," she said. "I only heard it a few times growing up." The reaction wasn't immediate. It was quieter than that, but it was unmistakable. Victor leaned back slowly, his grip tightening slightly on the arm of his chair, as if something had just aligned in a way he had been searching for but hadn't fully expected to find. Ethan noticed it too. Lena could feel it in the room. "Say that again," Victor said. "Pietro," Lena repeated, more certain this time. Victor closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in exhaustion, but in recognition. When he opened them again, something had changed. Not just in his expression, in the atmosphere itself. "For 50 years, he said quietly, "I've been looking for that name." The words didn't land all at once. They settled slowly, like something too heavy to fully register in a single moment. Lena felt a faint unease rise in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the sense that she had just stepped into something far larger than she had understood. "I don't," she started, but Victor raised his hand slightly. "Let me finish." He leaned forward, his voice steady now, but carrying a depth that felt less like explanation and more like confession. "When I first came to this country, I had nothing," he said. "No money, no connections, no language that anyone here respected. I worked wherever I could, factories, loading docks, anywhere that didn't ask too many questions." Lena listened, the pieces beginning to form, though she couldn't yet see the full picture. "There was a boarding house," Victor continued. "Small, overcrowded, full of men who were all trying to survive long enough to become something else. That's where I met him." He paused, not for effect, for memory. "Pietro Ricci," he said. The name felt different now, not distant, not abstract, immediate. "He was older than me," Victor continued. "A carpenter, skilled, disciplined, and patient in a way I wasn't. He had been saving for years, every dollar, every extra shift, every sacrifice, so he could open his own shop." Lena felt her breath slow slightly, her attention sharpening as the connection began to take shape. "He had $500, Victor said. In those days, that wasn't just money, it was a future." Ethan shifted slightly against the wall, his posture tightening as though he already knew where this was going and didn't like it. "I had an idea," Victor continued. "A way to build something faster, cheaper, more efficiently than anyone else at the time. But ideas don't matter if no one believes in them." He looked directly at Lena. "No bank would touch me." The room had gone completely still. Even Margaret's presence seemed to fade into the background. "One night," Victor said, "I told him everything. Not because I expected anything from him, but because I had nothing left to lose." He let out a slow breath. "And he listened." Lena could feel the story tightening now, moving toward something she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. "The next morning," Victor said, "he gave me the money." There it was. Simple, direct, irreversible. All of it, Victor added. Everything he had spent years building toward. Lena felt something shift inside her, something that wasn't fully formed yet but was already heavy with implication. "He didn't ask for paperwork," Victor continued. "Didn't ask for guarantees, he just said one thing." Victor's voice softened slightly, not weaker, but more personal. He said, "When you make it, you remember where it started." Silence followed. Not empty, full. Lena tried to speak, but the words didn't come easily. "My grandfather never owned a shop," she said finally, her voice quieter than before. "He worked construction his whole life." Victor nodded slowly. "I know." The confirmation landed harder than anything else. "I went back for him," Victor said, "years later, when I had money, when I had influence, when I could have given him everything he deserved." He paused again, but he was gone. Ethan stepped forward slightly now, his restraint beginning to thin. "This is unnecessary," he said. "Whatever this is." Victor didn't look at him. "Sit down." The authority in his voice wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Ethan stopped. Victor's attention returned to Lena. "I searched for decades," he said. "Records, contacts, anyone who might have known where he went, but names disappear, people disappear, and eventually you convince yourself that some debts can't be repaid." Lena felt it then, not just the story, the weight behind it. "But then," Victor continued, "you walked into that restaurant and said a word that no one in that room should have known." The connection was no longer subtle. "And suddenly," he said, "the past stopped being distant." Lena's hands had gone still in her lap, her mind moving faster than she could organize. "You think I'm connected to him," she said. Victor held her gaze. "I don't think," he replied. "I know." For a moment, Lena couldn't respond. Not because she didn't understand what Victor was saying, but because she understood it too well, and the implications of it were arriving all at once, too quickly to process cleanly. The room felt smaller now, more contained, as if everything that had been said had pulled the walls inward, forcing the truth into a space where it could no longer be avoided. "That's not possible," she said finally, though her voice carried less certainty than the words themselves. Victor didn't argue. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached slowly toward the desk beside him and pulled open a drawer that looked like it had been used thousands of times over the years. From inside, he took out a worn notebook. Thin, darkened with age, the edges softened from handling. He placed it carefully on the desk between them. "This is where it started," he said. Lena leaned forward slightly, her attention drawn to the object in a way that felt instinctive rather than deliberate. Victor opened the notebook with care, turning past several pages filled with numbers, notes, and handwriting that had faded just enough to show how much time had passed since they were written. Then he stopped. On the page in front of her there was a name. Not printed. Written. Pietro Ricci. Beneath it a number. Lena felt something in her chest tighten, not sharply, but steadily, like a realization settling into place piece by piece until it could no longer be denied. "My grandfather used to keep notebooks like this," she said quietly, almost to herself. "He wrote everything down, every dollar, every job, every expense. My mother used to say it was the only way he felt in control." Victor nodded once, slowly. "He trusted numbers more than people," he said. "But he trusted me anyway." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't heavy with tension. It was heavy with confirmation. Ethan stepped forward. He had been holding himself back up until now, allowing the conversation to unfold, but whatever patience he had was gone. "This proves nothing," he said, his voice sharper now, more direct. "A name in a notebook doesn't establish anything legally. You're drawing conclusions based on coincidence." Victor looked at him then, not with anger, but with something far more final. "For once," he said, "this isn't about legality." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Everything is about legality," he replied. "Especially when you're talking about ownership." There it was. Not concern, not confusion. Control. Victor closed the notebook gently, as though the discussion had already moved past the point where it needed to remain open. "You've spent your entire life trying to turn everything into a transaction," he said. "Every decision, every relationship, every outcome." "And it worked," Ethan said. "That's why we're here." Victor's expression didn't change. "No," he said, "it's why you're here." The distinction landed harder than anything else that had been said. Lena felt it too, not just the words, but the shift in direction they carried. This was no longer about the past alone. It was about what came next. Victor turned back to her. "For 50 years, he said, "I've carried something that didn't belong to me." He placed his hand on the notebook, not possessively, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement. "I built everything that followed from this." Lena shook her head slightly, still trying to ground herself in something stable. "You built an empire," she said. "That wasn't just $500. "No," Victor agreed, "it wasn't." He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. Not weaker, but more deliberate. "But it started there." The simplicity of it made it harder to argue. "And when something starts that way," he continued, You don't get to decide later that it no longer matters. Ethan let out a short breath, something close to disbelief. So, what is this? He asked. You're going to hand over everything because of a story? Victor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Lena again, not as if he were asking permission, but as if he were making sure she understood what was about to happen. Tomorrow morning, he said, there's a board meeting. Ethan's attention sharpened instantly. For what? Victor's gaze didn't shift. For correction, the word carried weight. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just final. The next morning, the boardroom at Hale Industries felt exactly the way it was designed to feel. Controlled, elevated, and just uncomfortable enough to remind everyone inside it that they were part of something larger than themselves. Floor-to-ceiling glass surrounded the space, giving a clear view of the city below. The table stretched long and polished, reflecting the overhead light in a way that made every movement visible, every shift in posture noticeable. Lena sat near the end of it, her hands resting calmly in front of her, though the calm didn't come naturally. It came from necessity. Around the table, the board members spoke in low, measured tones, discussing projections, strategies, outcomes that felt abstract compared to what she now knew was about to happen. Ethan stood at the head of the table, composed once again, every trace of yesterday's tension hidden beneath professionalism. This meeting will focus on. The doors opened. Victor entered. The room changed immediately, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. He wasn't in the wheelchair this time. He walked. Slowly, supported by a cane, each step deliberate, each movement controlled. But he walked. That alone was enough to silence the room. Ethan stopped speaking. For the first time since Lena had met him, he looked uncertain. Victor reached the head of the table and didn't sit immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, meeting each gaze briefly, not as a challenge, but as acknowledgement. Then he spoke. 50 years ago, he said, this company didn't exist. The board members shifted slightly, unsure where this was going. It started with an idea, Victor continued. And $500 that didn't belong to me. The room grew still. Ethan didn't interrupt. Not yet. Victor gestured toward Lena. And today, he said, that debt is being repaid. The words landed harder than anything else that morning. This is not a donation, Victor continued. It's not a gesture. It's not symbolic. His voice remained steady, but the authority behind it was absolute. It's correction. Margaret stepped forward then, placing a folder on the table and sliding it toward the center. The movement was simple, but the effect was immediate. Ethan's composure cracked. What is this? He asked, though he already knew. Control, Victor said. The room didn't erupt, it froze. 51%, Victor continued, transferred into a trust. He paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle. Under her name. Every eye in the room turned to Lena. Ethan laughed. Not because it was funny, because it didn't make sense. You can't be serious, he said. You're handing the company to someone who was serving tables 3 days ago. Victor looked at him calmly. I'm giving it back to the person it was taken from. The distinction was everything. Lena didn't speak. She didn't need to. Because for the first time in that room, she wasn't being overlooked. She was being recognized. And somewhere beneath the glass, steel, and power that had defined everything around her. A promise that had been forgotten for half a century had finally been kept. Victor rested his hand on the table, his voice quieter now, but no less certain. Some things don't lose their value with time, he said. They wait. The room remained silent. And in that silence, everything changed.